This is a true story told on a forum dedicated to urban explorers in 2012. Eric, Matt, and Stewie had been planning this trip for months. As passionate urban explorers, they had visited countless abandoned places in the US, forgotten factories, deserted amusement parks, and crumbling hospitals. But this time, they wanted something bigger, something legendary: Chernobyl. In 2012, gaining access to the exclusion zone wasn't easy. Official tours were available, but the real adventure was going in illegally, sneaking past guards, avoiding radiation hotspots, and surviving in the desolate remains of Pripyat. It was dangerous, but for them, that was part of the thrill. The three friends arrived in Kiev, Ukraine, blending in with the tourists. They had backpacks filled with supplies, food, Geiger counters, masks, and camping gear. They met up with their contact, a local guide named Dima, who had smuggled people into the zone before. He gave them last-minute warnings. Stay away from the reactor ruins, don't drink the water, and most importantly, if you see something strange, you turn around and leave. They laughed nervously. That night, under the cover of darkness, they slipped through a hole in the perimeter fence. Ahead of them, the ghost city of Pripyat loomed, waiting to reveal its secrets. The moment they crossed the fence, a strange silence surrounded them. No cars, no city noises. Just the rustling of the wind through dead trees and the distant creaking of abandoned buildings. It felt like stepping into another world. Dima led them through the thick underbrush, following a path known only to experienced stalkers. Their Geiger counters clicked occasionally, reminding them that this place was still very much alive in a way they couldn't see. After an hour of hiking, they reached the outskirts of Pripyat. The first buildings they saw were residential apartment blocks, their windows dark and hollow. Faded Soviet murals peeled from the walls. Rusted swings in a playground stood motionless, frozen in time. "Welcome to Pripyat," Dima whispered. Eric, Matt, and Stewie stood in awe. They had seen pictures, watched documentaries, but standing here in person, it was different. The air was heavy with history, with loss. "We'll rest in one of these buildings," Dima said. "Guards don't patrol this far at night." They climbed into a second-story apartment, careful not to disturb the broken glass and debris. They set up their sleeping bags, ate a quick meal of canned food, and whispered excitedly about the adventure ahead. As they settled in for the night, Stewie glanced out the window. The city was pitch black, except for the pale light of the moon. Then, just for a second, he thought he saw movement, something darting between the buildings. Probably just an animal, he muttered to himself. But deep inside, he wasn't so sure. The night in Pripyat was colder than they had expected. A chilling breeze seeped through the broken windows of the abandoned apartment, making their breath visible in the dim light of their flashlights. They had agreed to take turns keeping watch, though none of them really expected any trouble, at least not from anything human. Eric took the first shift, sitting by the window with his flashlight off, peering into the darkness below. The silence was unsettling, almost unnatural. Every now and then, a distant creak or an echoing clang would break the stillness, making his pulse quicken. But it was just the wind, he told himself. It had to be. Somewhere around 3 a.m., Matt shook him awake. "Your turn, man," he whispered. Eric groggily switched places, stretching his stiff muscles before curling into his sleeping bag. Matt stared out into the empty city, his mind drifting. He imagined what life must have been like before the disaster. The streets bustling with people, children playing in the parks. Now it was just a decaying ghost town, nature slowly reclaiming it. Then something caught his eye. A shadow moved across the street below. At first he thought it was an animal, a dog, maybe a fox. But the way it moved was strange. It wasn't walking on 4 legs, nor did it move like any human he'd ever seen. It was fast, but not in a natural way. It seemed to glide, vanishing into the ruins as quickly as it had appeared. Matt swallowed hard, gripping his flashlight. He wanted to wake the others, but what would he even say? "Hey guys, I saw a weird shadow?" They'd just tell him it was his imagination. He decided to stay quiet. But as the hours passed and dawn finally began to break, one thing was certain: Pripyat wasn't as empty as they had thought. As the first light of dawn painted the ruined city in pale gold, the three friends packed up their sleeping bags and prepared to move. None of them had slept well. Something about the night felt off, but no one wanted to be the first to admit it. Matt kept glancing over his shoulder as they made their way down the crumbling stairwell of the apartment building. He hadn't told Eric or Stewie about what he had seen. Maybe it really was just his tired mind playing tricks on him. "All right, let's head toward the amusement park," Eric said, unfolding their map. "We'll get some shots of the Ferris wheel, then make our way to the hospital." The amusement park was one of the most famous landmarks in Pripyat, its rusting Ferris wheel standing as a haunting reminder of the city's sudden abandonment. As they walked, they passed crumbling buildings covered in vines, children's toys left scattered in the dust, and old Soviet propaganda posters peeling from the walls. "This place is insane," Stewie muttered, snapping photos with his camera. "Like, it's creepy. Yeah, but it's also kind of beautiful in a weird way." As they stepped onto the cracked pavement of the amusement park, a soft crunch beneath Eric's boot made him freeze. Footprints. Fresh ones. And they weren't theirs. The three of them exchanged uneasy glances. "Could be other explorers?" Stewie whispered, though his voice lacked confidence. Eric crouched down, studying the prints. They were deep, suggesting something or someone heavy, and they weren't shaped like normal footprints. The edges looked wrong, like the weight had been unevenly distributed. "Maybe security patrols?" Matt offered, but Eric shook his head. "Nah, security wears boots. These look barefoot." A shiver ran down Stewie's spine. "Okay, so best case, we've got some weird guy running around barefoot in radioactive ruins. Worst case?" No one finished the sentence. For the first time since they had arrived, the city didn't just feel abandoned. It felt like they were being watched. The wind whistled through the skeletal remains of the Ferris wheel, rusted metal groaning under decades of decay. The three friends stood frozen, staring at the strange footprints in the dust. Eric was the first to break the silence. "We should keep moving." Matt nodded, gripping the straps of his backpack. "Yeah, if it's another Urbex group, we don't want to run into them. And if it's something else, I'd rather not stick around to find out." They moved quickly, skirting past the abandoned bumper cars and heading toward the hospital. The deeper they walked into the ruins, the heavier the silence became. Pripyat had always been eerily quiet. No cars, no voices, only the occasional sound of the wind. But now it felt like the silence had weight, like something unseen was pressing down on them. Every so often, Stewie would turn, swearing he saw movement in the corner of his eye. But each time there was nothing, just the hollow buildings, standing like tombstones in the empty city. As they approached the hospital, the air grew thicker, heavier. The structure loomed ahead of them, its windows dark and empty. The entrance was partially collapsed, but they managed to slip through a gap in the rubble. Inside, the darkness swallowed them whole. Dust hung in the air, disturbed only by their cautious footsteps. The hallway stretched before them, lined with rusted gurneys and discarded medical equipment. Old papers and Soviet-era documents littered the floor. "Welcome to one of the most radioactive places in Pripyat," Matt muttered. Eric scanned the Geiger counter strapped to his chest. The clicks were steady, higher than normal, but not dangerous as long as they didn't linger too long. "This is where they treated the first responders," Eric whispered. "After the explosion, they brought them here before flying them to Moscow," Stewie shuddered. "And their gear is still in the basement, the most radioactive stuff in the whole city." They moved cautiously, weaving through the wreckage. A rusted wheelchair sat in the middle of the hallway, its wheels long frozen in place. On one of the walls, faded handprints streaked down in a rusty brown color. "Blood?" Stewie whispered. "Or just rust," Eric said, though his voice lacked conviction. As they rounded a corner, a sudden sound made them freeze. A soft shuffling. Not the wind, not the building settling. Something else, something inside the hospital with them. Eric slowly turned, lifting his flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating a figure standing at the far end of the hallway. It wasn't human. It was tall, unnaturally so, with elongated limbs and pale, almost translucent skin. Its eyes, if they were eyes, reflected the light like an animal's in the dark. And then, in an instant, it was gone. Vanished into the shadows. The three friends stood frozen, their hearts hammering in their chests. "Tell me you saw that," Stewie breathed. "I saw it," Matt whispered. Eric didn't say anything. He was too busy listening, because now there were footsteps, and they were getting closer. Eric's hand tightened around his flashlight as the footsteps grew louder. The sound was slow, deliberate, almost as if whatever was out there was taking its time. "Move," he whispered, barely audible over the sound of their own breathing. The three of them turned and hurried down the hallway, careful not to trip over the debris littering the floor. The walls seemed to close in on them as they ran, the shadows stretching and shifting unnaturally. They reached a door marked with faded Cyrillic writing. Eric shoved it open, and they stumbled into what looked like an old operating room. Rusted surgical equipment was scattered across the floor. A gurney with its torn mattress sat in the center, its metal frame caked with years of dust. Matt spun around and pressed the door shut, his back against it. "Did you see where it went?" he panted. "No," Stewie said, his voice shaky. "It just disappeared." Eric checked his Geiger counter. The clicking had increased, but it wasn't from radiation. It was from their rapid movement and stress. He turned his flashlight toward the far side of the room, illuminating another door. "We need to get out of here," he said. Matt nodded and grabbed the handle, but it wouldn't budge. "Locked," he cursed. Stewie turned back toward the door they had come through. "So, what do? We can't just—" A noise cut him off, a low scraping sound. Something was moving outside the room. They all held their breath, pressing against the wall as the sound grew closer. The door handle rattled. Stewie's hand shot out, gripping Eric's wrist. His face was pale, his eyes wide with terror. Eric turned off his flashlight. The room plunged into darkness. Silence. Then, soft breathing from the other side of the door. It was standing there, waiting. A long moment passed. The air was thick with tension. Then the footsteps slowly receded. One step, another, fading into the darkness of the hospital. Eric exhaled, his body trembling. "We need to go. Now." Matt reached for his backpack and pulled out a crowbar. "Step back," he whispered. With a grunt, he jammed the crowbar into the door on the far side of the room and pried it open with a loud crack. The three of them slipped through the gap, finding themselves in a stairwell leading down into the basement. Eric hesitated. "The basement is where they kept the first responders' clothing. It's—" "I don't care," Stewie cut him off. "I'd rather take my chances with radiation than whatever that was." Matt shined his flashlight down the stairs. The passageway descended into complete darkness, the steps covered in layers of dust and debris. Eric took a deep breath and started down. One by one, they disappeared into the depths of the hospital. Behind them, somewhere in the shadows, something watched. The cold air thickened as they descended the crumbling staircase, their flashlights casting flickering beams of light against the damp concrete walls. The deeper they went, the heavier the silence became, oppressive, almost unnatural. Stewie wiped the sweat from his forehead. "I swear, if we run into another one of those things—" Eric shot him a look. "We don't even know what we saw." Matt kept his eyes on the steps ahead. "We know enough, and we know it wasn't human." The stairs ended at a rusted metal door, slightly ajar. A faint musty smell seeped through the opening, a mix of damp decay and something else. Something metallic. Eric nudged the door open with the end of his crowbar, and it creaked painfully. Their flashlight beams swept across the room beyond. Rows of abandoned lockers lined the walls. Tattered firefighter uniforms, stiff with age, hung in eerie stillness. Some were draped over rusted benches, others crumpled in piles on the floor, their once bright colors faded to dull brown. A thick layer of dust coated everything, disturbed only by their footsteps. "This is where they left their gear," Eric whispered. "The first responders who rushed in after the explosion." Stewie exhaled sharply. "Yeah, well, it doesn't look like we're alone." They turned to where he was pointing. Footprints, fresh footprints, leading deeper into the room. Matt crouched, examining the tracks. They were large, too large for any of them, and irregular, as if whoever left them had an unnatural gait. Eric's stomach tightened. "We need to be careful." The three of them followed the tracks cautiously, moving past overturned lockers and scattered debris. The footprints led toward a partially collapsed corridor, where a jagged hole in the wall revealed another chamber beyond. A deep, echoing drip sounded from somewhere inside. Eric hesitated. "We don't have to go in." Stewie tightened his grip on his flashlight. "Yeah, we do." Matt exhaled, then took the lead, stepping through the crumbling opening. The others followed. They found themselves in a room lined with old radiation suits hanging from hooks, their plastic visors covered in dust. Some of the suits had collapsed inward, as if whatever had been inside had rotted away completely. The footprints led to the center of the room, then stopped. No exit. No sign of where they had gone. Eric's breath came shallow. What the hell? A scraping noise echoed from the darkened far corner of the room. Stewie's flashlight flickered as he swung it toward the sound. Something shifted in the shadows. Low, labored breathing filled the air. Then, movement. From within one of the hanging radiation suits. The fabric shuddered, as if something inside was trying to move. Then it took a step forward. Matt stumbled back, nearly dropping his flashlight. Go! Now! They turned and bolted for the exit, scrambling through the jagged hole in the wall. Behind them, the sound of shuffling footsteps grew louder. Not just one set, many. The radiation suits moved in unison, as if waking from a long, restless slumber. Eric didn't look back. He didn't want to see. They reached the stairwell and hurled themselves up the steps, their breaths ragged, hearts pounding. Only when they burst through the hospital doors, back into the open air of the dead city, did they finally stop running. Chest heaving, Matt turned back toward the building, his face pale. What the hell was that? Eric swallowed hard. I don't know. But deep down, he had a feeling they hadn't seen the last of it. The trio stood outside the hospital, panting, hands on their knees as they caught their breath. The night was eerily silent, except for the distant rustling of wind through the empty streets. Stewie wiped his face with his sleeve. Tell me we're done with basements. Eric shook his head. We need to be smarter. We don't know what the hell is going on here, but we can't keep rushing into places like that. Matt was still staring at the hospital entrance. The doors hung slightly open, swaying ever so slightly as if something inside had disturbed them. Then he noticed something else. Guys, he said, voice hushed. We're being watched. Eric and Stewie froze. Slowly, they turned, following Matt's gaze toward a crumbling apartment block across the street. On the third floor, in a shattered window frame, a figure stood perfectly still. A tall, humanoid silhouette. No features, no movement, just watching. A chill crawled up Eric's spine. How long has it been there? I don't know, Matt whispered. I just saw it. Then, movement. Another figure stepped into view on the fourth floor, then another on the second. Stewie let out a sharp breath. Okay, that's not normal. One by one, the figures emerged from different windows, silent, unmoving. Their presence felt wrong, like shadows cast by something that wasn't there. Eric's instincts screamed at him to move. We need to go, now. Without another word, they turned and hurried down the street, resisting the urge to break into a full sprint. The empty city loomed around them, abandoned cars and skeletal trees casting distorted shadows under the moonlight. Every so often, Matt glanced back. The figures were still there, watching, not following, just standing in the windows. Eric's grip tightened on his backpack strap. We need to get out of the open. Stewie scanned their surroundings, then pointed to a rusting bus overturned near the remains of a supermarket. There, we can hide until morning. They scrambled toward it, slipping into the hollowed-out interior. The air inside smelled of mildew and old metal. Stewie peeked through a crack in the bus frame. Do you think they're still there? Matt didn't answer right away. Then, in a slow, measured voice, he said, One of them is closer. Eric tensed. Where? Near the road, just standing there. Silence filled the bus. None of them dared move. The only sound was their breathing. Then, without warning, a soft but deliberate tapping echoed from the roof of the bus. Tap, tap, tap. Eric's stomach dropped. Something was right above them. The tapping continued, slow and deliberate. Each tap echoed throughout the abandoned bus, sending shivers down Eric's spine. Stewie, who had been crouched by a cracked window, froze and glanced at Matt. What the hell is that? Matt didn't answer right away. He was focused on the sound. It's not human, he whispered, his eyes wide. Eric tried to keep his breathing steady. We need to stay calm. Maybe it's just the wind or an animal. But deep down, he knew that wasn't true. This wasn't like anything they'd encountered before. Stewie couldn't sit still. He slowly crept toward the entrance of the bus and peered out into the dimly lit street. We need to know what it is, he muttered. We can't just hide here. Matt shook his head. We wait. No sudden moves. Let's see if it goes away. The tapping stopped suddenly. An eerie silence filled the bus, stretching out in every direction. Eric held his breath. Then, without warning, a loud scrape sounded from above the bus. Something heavy, far too heavy for any animal, shifted on the roof. Matt's eyes went wide. It's not leaving. It's circling us. Stewie's face was pale. I don't care what it is. We need to move. Now. Eric knew Stewie was right. The tension had built too much, and they couldn't afford to sit and wait any longer. They needed to get out of the bus. Matt slid open the door, and the rusty hinges squealed in protest as they quickly slipped out into the cold night air. They didn't look back as they ran down the street, their feet pounding against the cracked pavement. But the heavy presence followed them, something unseen lurking just beyond their peripheral vision. We're being watched, Eric whispered, glancing over his shoulder. Stewie, his breath ragged, nodded. I can feel it. We need to get out of the open. They ducked down an alleyway, at the shadows offering temporary concealment. They pressed themselves against the crumbling walls of an old building, trying to stay as quiet as possible. From their hiding spot, they could hear the scraping again. It was moving closer. Eric's heart pounded in his chest. It knows we're here. Matt strained his ears, listening carefully. We can't stay here forever. We need to find a safer place. They waited in the darkness, barely daring to move. Time stretched on, and still the tapping continued. Always close, but never quite near enough to see what was causing it. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. Eric didn't move. He stayed pressed against the wall, his eyes scanning the dark street ahead. After a few minutes of silence, Matt spoke in a barely audible voice. It's gone, for now. Stewie let out a shaky breath. We need to go before whatever that thing was comes back. Eric nodded grimly. Let's keep moving. We're not safe here. The three of them set off into the empty streets once more, their hearts racing as they left behind whatever had been stalking them in the night. The streets of Pripyat were eerie and desolate, but it was the decaying buildings that unnerved the trio the most. They had wandered through several empty streets, and the sense of being utterly isolated was beginning to weigh on them. We need to find shelter, Eric said, his voice low. Somewhere we can figure out our next move. Matt nodded. I agree, but we have to be careful. We don't know what's still out there. After a few more minutes of walking, they turned a corner and came upon an old, crumbling hospital. Its broken windows and rusted gates seemed to beckon them forward. The structure was massive, almost as if it had been abandoned overnight. Let's check it out, Stewie said, his curiosity getting the better of him. Maybe there's something useful inside. They cautiously approached the entrance, the ground littered with broken glass and debris. The doors to the hospital were wide open, creaking as they swayed in the wind. They exchanged nervous glances but decided to go in. As they stepped inside, the air grew musty. The stench of decay and mildew hung thick, but the darkness within the building was far more overwhelming. They turned on their flashlights, the beams cutting through the blackness and revealing rooms that had long been forgotten. I don't like this, Matt muttered, looking around. This place feels wrong. Eric and Stewie stayed close, navigating through the abandoned hospital's long hallways. The walls were adorned with faded posters, some torn and yellowed from years of neglect. They came across examination rooms, some of which still had old medical equipment scattered about. But the deeper they went into the hospital, the more uneasy they became. It wasn't just the decaying building. It was the feeling that something was watching them, lurking just out of sight. This place is giving me the creeps, Stewie said, shivering. Let's just find a place to rest and get out. They found their way to what appeared to be a small lounge area. There was an old couch, the fabric worn and covered in dust, but it would have to do for a short rest. As they sat down, they noticed a strange noise coming from somewhere deep in the building, a low, rhythmic thumping. It echoed through the corridors like something moving, something with purpose. Not again, Eric whispered, his heart starting to race. Stay still, Matt urged, his voice tense. Let's listen. The thumping grew louder. It was now accompanied by dragging noises, like something heavy scraping across the floor. It was coming closer, and whatever it was, it didn't sound like it belonged in the hospital. Stewie looked around frantically. We need to leave, now. But as they tried to stand up, the thumping stopped. A chilling silence took over the room, and for a moment, they thought maybe it had been their imagination. Suddenly, the distant sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway, faint but unmistakable. The noise grew louder, and a shadow passed by the cracked doorframe. Someone, or something, was walking through the hospital, and it was moving in their direction. "Move," Eric hissed. "Now." They quickly gathered their belongings and dashed down the hallway, trying to keep their footsteps as silent as possible. The last thing they wanted was to draw attention to themselves. They reached the entrance of the hospital just as the footsteps grew louder. A dark figure emerged from the shadows behind them, but they didn't stop to look. Without hesitation, they sprinted out of the building and into the open street. Breathing heavily, they stopped for a moment to catch their breath. The figure had vanished, but they all knew it was still out there. "We can't stay in that city any longer," Stewie said, his voice trembling. "We need to move out of here. Fast." Eric nodded, eyes scanning the empty street. "This place is not safe anymore. Let's get out of here before things get worse." The trio took one last look at the eerie hospital, the door creaking in the wind behind them, and they ran off into the night, uncertain of what dangers still awaited them in the abandoned ruins of Pripyat. The end of part 1.